At this point, I want to introduce Charlie Clements, who's going to address us this morning, and I want to tell you just a little bit about Charlie, to give you a little background. Charlie, of course, is the new CEO and president of UUSC Cambridge. He was the director of human rights education at UUSC from 1986 to 1988, and organized delegations of members of Congress to travel on fact-finding visits to Central America, which was pioneered by the Service Committee. He also testified before Congress on several occasions about his firsthand experiences of the ravages of war in that region. Charlie is a Vietnam War veteran whose experience transformed his worldview. He served in Vietnam after graduating with honors from the U.S. Air Force Academy, but left military service after he refused to fly missions in support of the invasion of Cambodia. He says, out of the experience of Vietnam, I dedicated myself to nonviolence. He worked as a physician in Guazapa, El Salvador during the 80s, was responsible for the health care and preventive medicine for 10,000 civilians in rural communities. He developed public health campaigns, training programs for medics, and the provision of acute medical services in conditions of extreme duress. He saw firsthand how the policies of the U.S. government were destroying the social fabric of the communities of El Salvador. He also got involved after the experience in El Salvador, and he saw how landmines had wrecked the lives of children. He says he became involved in the campaign against landmines. He was a board member for Physicians for Human Rights and participated in the Nobel Peace Prize-winning campaign, as I said, to ban landmines. I could really go on, Charlie, with your background. He is most recently was executive director of Border Waterworks, a New Mexico-based nonprofit that assists U.S. communities along the Mexican border to deal with water and wastewater issues. He's received many awards, but at this point in time, I think I'm just going to invite him to come on up. Charlie Clements.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Marguerite, and thank you, Conrad, and thank you, Chris, and thank you, Unit Board. There are so many people in Tiago that help put together an event like this, and the staff of the church. So I'm very grateful for all the energy that you put into this, and all of you for coming. I know that some of you have come great distances, so thank you. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and to be with you this morning. I'm glad there's a clock here because we have a fairly efficient taskmaster in Chris, and I have 55 minutes left to say all I want to say. I would like to leave 20 minutes for questions and answers so that we can have a little bit of back and forth. And so let me begin with our new vision statement. And this hasn't been in public yet because the board hasn't affirmed it, but they're working on it. I'm going to pass about 20 copies of it out, 10 for each side, and so 3 or 4 people have to share it. I didn't print that many, but I'd like you to take a look at it because I think it says a lot more explicitly what a lot of you have been doing for 20 or 30 years. Our last mission statement was a little bit tame, I think. It didn't express as clearly who we are and why we exist. So do understand this is a draft. The board needs to do their little bit of work on it, but the staff has worked on this in the last year. And it says, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee is dedicated to protecting and advancing human rights, which represent a universal yearning for justice, equality, and freedom. Affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every person, UUSC works to eradicate economic injustice, defend civil liberties, and promote environmental justice by engaging our members and supporters to be political and social activists, partnering with communities and organizations confronting unjust power structures, challenging oppressive policies in the United States and around the world. We thought it important to actually say that we want our members to be political and social activists. We know that some of our members will only be able to write checks, and that's terribly important. But we also want people who want to change the world and have the time and energy to do that, and I know that's why you're here today. We thought it was also important to say that we partner with communities and organizations that confront unjust power structures, because our partners overseas are often those kind of organizations, and we will partner with organizations here engaging in that same kind of activity. And lastly, as Americans, we feel it's terribly important to challenge oppressive policies of our own government as well as others around the world when we can do that. So I think that this is part of the result of a year-long process that we've gone through called Program Review and Refocus, where we were attempting to ask ourselves, what should we be doing in the world? And part of that started with this new vision statement. The result of that year-long process is 3 new program directions. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of those this morning. The broad categories of those are environmental justice, and within that specific category, we're choosing to defend the human right to water, a right just recognized by the United Nations recently. Another broad category is civil liberties, and I know that some of you got to meet Jennifer Harberry, and within that category, we've chosen to work toward ending US-sanctioned torture. And our third category is economic justice, and within that direction, we're going to be focusing on living wages and what that means, on fair trade, and on labor rights around the world, largely in an attempt to address the growing gap between rich and poor, the growing inequities in the world between haves and have-nots, because we think that is a breeding ground for instability, a breeding ground for terrorism, and a breeding ground for resentment. With regard to that first category, in the next Service Committee news, you're going to see the remarks from the President that I'm going to share with you largely today. I think they gave me 500 words, and I wrote about 700, leaving it to the staff to figure out how to cut them down. But suppose that your local water company, whether in Long Beach or whether you're farther up the coast or in San Diego, suppose that it was privatized and a 30-year concession to run it was sold to a foreign company. Suppose that the winning bid was awarded because the company promised the greatest reduction in rates, and that's what your city council was interested in, and they said that they were going to invest more in your water system than any of the other competitors. So those were the 2 criteria for awarding the grant. But suppose that the foreign company turned around and convinced your government that really, instead of lowering rates, they should raise the rates. And suppose the rates ended up being very quickly 50% higher than they were when the negotiations began. Suppose that the foreign company had promised you they were going to invest $1 billion in your water system and your wastewater system, but in the end they only provided $60 million and borrowed the $940 million from the World Bank. And suppose the reason you sold in the first place is because the World Bank told you, your city, we don't have any loans for cities for this kind of work. But they turned around and loaned it to the private company that wanted to buy your water system. Suppose that the return on that investment, that the profit margin in that water company was far higher than the return on profit in most companies in your neighborhood. Suppose further that this company noticed that it could make more on water services than it could on sewer services, so they decided to quit extending sewer services but continued aggressively extending the water services because they could make money on that. And in fact, the result was that raw sewage was dumped into rivers, streets, and open fields because there was no place to dispose of it. Suppose further that the company then defaulted on $700 million in loans to the International Lending Institution, and the lending institution itself began to threaten your city that perhaps it was time to raise rates again because you weren't paying enough for your water services. Suppose that it was discovered that the major shareholders in the company that bought your water system were in their own country facing criminal and civil lawsuits. In their own courts, there were accusations of bribery of public officials, illegal contributions, kickbacks, fixing prices, operating cartels, and false accounting. This is not a hypothetical case. It's the tragic tale of what happened in Argentina between 1993 and 2000. When the government was forced by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to sell the rights to run the Buenos Aires water system and wastewater system to a French consortium known as Aguas Argentinas. This undertaking was the poster child for a number of years of how successful privatization could be and what it could mean to communities before it began to unravel. It is now a precondition for countries in the world who want to renew their World Bank loans and their international monetary loans, and nobody pays these off. They just renegotiate them year after year. It's now a precondition. Any country, before they can renew their World Bank loans, has to agree to privatization of their utilities. Also their schools and hospitals, but their utilities are where the dollars are. Enron was aggressively buying up water companies in South Texas and South India before it went under, because it had learned from California, when you control the utilities, there are billions to be made. If you control the spigot like they did the flow of electricity in this state, they knew there was a lot to be made. This is the scenario with privatization around the world today, but it's not just happening over there, because the Bush administration has made it exceedingly hard for municipalities to borrow to repair the aging water and wastewater systems that were first built in the 1970s with the Clean Water Act, because they too want to force privatization. And there are 6 foreign companies in the world aggressively buying up American and other water companies around the world. And these are some of the kinds of nightmares that are occurring. You will find stories about these in the future on our website. It's just a piece of the global water crisis that we're examining. But in fact, the world is looking at a global water crisis. Although 70% of the world is covered by water, only 1% of that water is fresh water. Sometimes in some countries they call it sweet water. And of that 1%, which is fresh water, only 1% is available to us, because the rest is locked up in glaciers for the most part. And of that 1%, 70% is used by agriculture, largely industrialized agriculture. 22% is used by industries around the world, and 8% of it is less for human use and human consumption. We are mining water from aquifers that has taken millions of years for that water to be deposited in, and it's called mining because we're taking it out faster than it's being replenished and it's being depleted. And that's not something happening over there only, although it's happening in many, many countries. It's happening here. So the city of El Paso and the city of Juarez, twin cities, where I have worked quite a bit in the last 10 years, are sitting on top of an aquifer that is estimated will run dry between the year 2015 and the year 2020. And both sides are sticking straws into the ground as quickly as they can and using that water without regard to the future. And on the U.S. side, the El Paso Water Company, which has always been very far-sighted and has a lot of resources, has been buying up ranches like crazy in the region because they're going to pump the water out of those from below those ranches and pipe that water to El Paso. But in Mexico, where all water is owned by the federal government, and Juarez is about as far from the federal government as you can get, they don't have the ability to do that. And the federal government is not very worried about Juarez. It's a long ways away, and it's been kind of an opposition town for some times. And they're going to be looking the crisis in the eye without the kind of resources that El Paso does. But they have, of course, 6 times the population of El Paso. And we found out during the peso crisis of 1994 that, in fact, when Juarez burps, El Paso gets heartburn. And so they're going to be looking at a serious crisis. But the same thing is happening in many other places. The Oglala aquifer is the one that underlies much of Texas and the plains in our country where a lot of our farming is done. And it's being depleted at rapid rates as well. Part of the global crisis has to do with contamination as well. And it's always contamination of those who can't stand up to the perpetrators. So one of the places that this is happening that I was connected with are Navajo communities in the Southwest. One of them known as Church Rock. And there, commercial uranium companies have been proposing for some time to do injection mining. And they intend to inject wells into the aquifer. They will inject sodium bicarbonate into the aquifer, and it will leach out the naturally occurring uranium. They'll then suck that water out of the ground. They will separate out the slurry from the water, inject the remainder back in, although they propose to do so at a level which is permitted in this country, 400 times what the World Health Organization recommends for uranium content in water, perhaps ruining that aquifer for tens of thousands of years. They're proposing to air dry that slurry, and they were proposing to do so in a community, in a place upwind of Church Rock, such that 22 physicians in the Indian Health Service have said that if the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, approves this permit, they will resign en masse from the hospital in Church Rock. And this poaching of water occurs in a country that has a surplus of uranium. This is happening in a country that is in fact offering to subsidize this. So Heather Wilson, the congressman from New Mexico, who is the darling of the uranium industry and the protege of Senator Domenici, has introduced a bill that has passed that would provide a $22 million subsidy, not a tax break, but a cash subsidy to encourage this injection mining, because otherwise it has been shown to be not economically profitable. That's just one story. There are many. On the Navajo and Hopi land in Arizona, 1 million gallons of water is used today. And just think, where if you had some images of the Hopi mesas, that's one of the driest portions of the United States. They learned intensive agricultural practices now that are thought of as brilliant because they're practiced in Israel, where they could capture a few drops of rain and channel it to their corn plants because they survived on this high mesa. Now 1 million gallons of water are pumped a day to transport coal. Coal is mined and turned into a powder, and that water is used as this transport mechanism to carry that coal to the Four Corners power stations so we can have cheap electricity. Not to mention not totally clean electricity because it's produced by burning coal. But of course, if anybody tried to injection mine, I know that some of your water sources in LA come from Antelope Valley, I think is the name of it up north, such that it was going to be contaminated with uranium, you'd be able to stop it because there'd be a great hue and cry. The Navajo have been working 10 years to stop this injection mining, and hearing after hearing. Waterworks, the small NGO that I used to run, sent a delegation of elders and youngsters to the last NRC hearing to help them present their case, and they got another stay about, I think, about 9 months in that process. So these are some of the issues that we're going to be working on in water. We're going to focus on privatization in the beginning, but we think that defending the human right to water is something that's terribly important around the world. Our second program area is in civil liberties, and as I said, we have chosen to develop a campaign to stop US-sanctioned torture. I mentioned that it's being led by Jennifer Harberry. I'm honored that she is on our staff. She's an American lawyer whose husband, a Mayan resistance leader, was tortured to death by CIA operatives in Guatemala. As a result of that, was finally brought to light by her fasting almost to the death on the steps of the Guatemalan capital and on the capital of ours as well. The CIA knew about that. They allowed it to happen. It was perpetrated by people that were on their payroll. Jennifer managed to pass almost single-handedly the Harberry Rule, which forbid the CIA from hiring known torturers and known criminals without the express permission of the director of the CIA. That rule was thrown out the window after 9/11. It opened the door for the kinds of abuses that we have been seeing in Abu Ghraib in Iraq, in Guantanamo in Cuba, and in Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. We think this is a stain on our national moral fabric. And to explain just a little bit further, we have signed the International Convention on Torture that many of us thought in the 1980s would begin to be the end of torture, much like some of the laws that were passed in Great Britain in the early 19th century were the beginning of the end of slavery, that there began to be a paradigm shift. And we thought there would be a paradigm shift in torture. That convention, that treaty, which is one of many that flows from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, specifically says that systematic torture is a crime against humanity. And crimes against humanity came to us from the charter of the court in Nuremberg when they were trying to address what happened in the Holocaust. And they said a crime against humanity is something that is so heinous that it's a crime against the victims as well as all of us who are living. It's a crime against humanity. And it will enjoy universal jurisdiction, meaning it can be tried any place where a court declares jurisdiction, and it will enjoy no statute of limitations, meaning it can be tried in perpetuity. And today, the former president and the former dictator and the former general in Chile, Augusto Pinochet, is being tried in courts there for crimes against humanity, crimes for which he was first indicted in Spain when a courageous judge there, Balthasar Garzón, decided to invoke that concept of universal jurisdiction. We think that the degree of what has happened in Bagram and Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib rises to the level of systematic torture. The Convention on Torture says that systematic torture is a crime against humanity, and while we may not be able to try Donald Rumsfeld and Alberto Gonzalez in a court of law today, we propose that we're going to do so in a mock trial in September. Some of you who may have been around as long as I have may remember that Bertrand Russell held some mock trials in London and Paris in the 1960s, holding the U.S. in contempt of international law for what we were doing in Vietnam, and they attracted a lot of attention. We hope our mock trial will attract that similar kind of attention. We intend to stream it through the internet. So if you rented a big screen TV, you could watch the trial in a room like this with others. We want it to be watched in community, not to be done in the isolation on your computer, although you can watch it there too. And we will have indictment ceremonies in May, and we hope that you'll have them in each of your own communities, where you will take this indictment we have prepared, create your own ceremony around it, and perhaps deliver that indictment to a federal building. We hope to follow that trial, which will be held on a Sunday in Washington, D.C., sometime in September, by a day or two of intense lobbying, so people who come to Washington, D.C. to watch the trial can then engage their members of Congress and senators and tell them we want this loophole on torture closed, that we as a nation are better than that we should be an example to the rest of the world, and that the end of torture should start here, if no place else. So that is part of our campaign, and of course it's going to require enormous amounts of education. We will be preparing packets for you so that you can hold house meetings and meetings in churches and show films and educate people about this. It's not an easy topic to talk about, but certainly if people can be victims of it, we can talk about it. We can give them voice. There is one of the best centers for the treatment of torture that exists in the world here in Los Angeles, run by a wonderful Chilean physician, Jose Quiroga. And at some point in the rehabilitation of torture victims, they need to talk about it. They need to be able to share their experiences, to externalize them. And maybe some of our forums can give them opportunity to do that. We certainly have probably the most credible spokesperson and experienced person to lead this campaign in Jennifer Harberry, and you'll be hearing from her either in person or I want to thank Ted for making, others for making that video, and we're going to make some of her presentations available for those who can't hear her in person, so you can use that as an organizing tool as well. Our third piece of the program is about economic justice. It's about the belief that extreme poverty around the world is a breeding ground for resentment and for despair and ultimately terrorism. But it will operate on many levels, and it will operate here where we will encourage people to understand and look into what living wage campaigns mean. It will operate with our fair trade coffee program, but on a much more sophisticated level than we have in the past. It will include delegations to visit coffee plantations in Central America and to understand from those people living on those cooperatives what it means to be able to have health care and schools for their children that other coffee workers that sell to Maxwell House won't be able to have. But it'll also include activities that you can engage your Sunday schools in, so they can sell fair trade chocolate and engage youth in this and develop a sense of justice and to understand why children are often held in virtual slavery on cocoa plantations in West Africa. It'll be a wide-reaching campaign, and not a campaign, we're warned, it'll be easy for you to use. Marilyn Sewell, the minister of the UU Church in Portland, who is one of the ministers that is on a recently formed advisory committee that I have formed of ministers that I want to seek their counsel and advice on what we do. She said they've been doing economic justice in her church for 5 years, and it's been the hardest thing they've ever done. But we will find creative ways to do this. We're working with Chuck Collins from United for a Fair Economy. I don't know how many of you have run across the work that he does, and we'll be working with many others to make this a program that is accessible. Because in the end, in all of these programs, if we don't give people something that say, I can do this, then they won't be successful. And if we don't give them something that a small group of people can do, and people can do in social justice committees and ultimately in congregations, and then maybe in coalitions like are formed in California with the UU Legislative Ministry, then ultimately our programs won't be very successful. And we understand that, and that's our challenge, to create those many levels of engagement in our programs. And they begin with engagement of volunteers like yourself. I'm very, very happy to be at the Service Committee, and in large part that stems from my great pleasure at working with the constituency. I'm one of the founding board members of Physicians for Human Rights, and I've worked with that organization for some years. It's fairly new. It was only formed in about 1985, so it's about 20 years old. has about the same budget of UUSC, has about the same number of staff. But when I compare whether I'd like to work there or work at UUSC, to me there's very little difficulty about that decision, although I love what PHR does, and we've shared the Nobel Prize for the Landmines campaign. But Physicians for Human Rights doesn't have any boots on the ground, to use George Bush's euphemism for what our men and women are doing in Iraq. And our boots on the ground are all of you. You know, we have people in churches throughout this country who are willing to devote their time to promoting what we do, to engaging their congregations in doing it, to promoting guests at your table, and Justice Sunday. And by the way, the materials for this Justice Sunday are about water this year, and I think there'll be some packets of those available to you later in the day. But we are able to be what we are because of volunteers. And that means volunteers on many levels, from the level of the people who chair our national volunteer effort, and there's a couple of those in this room, to regional coordinators who chair it for a group of 10 or 12 local reps, to the local reps, to those of you who may not be local reps but volunteer in activities in your congregation, in engaging people in our programs or programs of your own social justice committees. Volunteers are our boots on the ground. They're what enable us to do the work that we do. And our work is social justice. Our work is understanding how the human rights system is moving this world in a very hopeful way, a more powerful force than anything else I personally know. At General Assembly, when I was meeting with groups of ministers trying to get to know a number of them, one of them said, "Why do you do what you do?" And the question kind of caught me by surprise. Hadn't thought about that for a while. And I do what I do because I think that human rights are the most positive force moving the world forward that I can see. And it began in the late 1940s when Eleanor Roosevelt and a group of people from around the world helped give birth to a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That had no force in law. It was merely a collection of 30 articles, and we'll make sure that each of you get one of these in the future, because I think all local reps should have a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Very idealistic. Article 6 says everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Article 3 says everyone shall have the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 15 says everyone has the right to a nationality. Article 21 says everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. It has some. Article 26 says everyone has the right to education. Article 24 says everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including a reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. Radical concepts are to be called communist today, I'm sure, if anyone tried to articulate this document today. And over the last 50 years, there has been a blossoming of this little flower around the world. And so 10 years after this was published, child rights activists took this Declaration of Human Rights and said, let's create a declaration on the rights of the child. And they did that. Again, just an idealistic statement. And then for 20 years, people took that Declaration on the Rights of the Child and worked on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And convention is human rights parlance for a treaty. And that treaty on the rights of the child, when it has been signed and ratified by the parliaments of 60 nations, enters force and becomes international law. 191 out of the 192 countries in the United Nations system have now signed and ratified that Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it creates an international morality of sorts that cuts across religions and borders and language and race and economies. Imagine, 191 nations have agreed these are the rights that every child should have if they're born into this world. And of course, the nation that hasn't signed it is the United States. We find ourselves on the outside of the community of civilized nations. That's what the State Department used to call nations in the 1980s that reneged on treaties or wouldn't sign them. Would say they're outside the community of civilized nations. That's precisely where we find ourselves today. In the case of this treaty, and there are many, the Landmines Treaty and others, but there are many, in the case of this one, we don't want to give up the right to have child soldiers, as I was when I was 17, because we say that the rest of the world says that children should be allowed to reach 18 before we put a weapon in their hands and ask them to kill somebody else in the name of some kind of national pride. And we also say, the rest of the world that is, says that the adolescent heart and mind are in formation, and if they commit a grievous error before they're 18, that they should be given a second chance, or at least not have their lives taken away. Maybe they'll remain in jail the rest of their lives, but we shouldn't take their lives away. And in this country, we like to try juveniles as adults and then execute them when they reach age 18. And you might have noticed with the Charles Malvo situation that Alabama was saying, let's try him here. We can execute him here, his 16-year-old accomplice. And Virginia was saying, no, we can try him here. It'll be quicker here. We don't have such a long appeals procedure. And states were competing to see who could try that juvenile. He did terrible things. There's no doubt about it. He was influenced by an adult who apparently mentored him in these terrible things. But the rest of the world says his heart and his mind were still in formation, and he shouldn't have to give his life because of those mistakes and the influence of the adults in his life. So this UN system is moving the world, this UN human rights system, I should say, is moving the world, I think, in a positive direction. And it's slow. Just because that declaration is passed doesn't mean that child exploitation in India stops, but it means there's a hook and law in India, and those activists working to end child labor in India can use that hook and law to try to advance their agenda. And it creates then solidarity across national lines with NGOs working to end child labor. And slowly, things like that mount, as they did to the campaign to ban landmines, and result in a convention. And others would say, well, these treaties they have no force in law, they have no enforcement mechanism, they have no teeth. Well, the landmines campaign that the US and China and Russia refused to sign has now resulted in about 75 million landmines being destroyed. It has started a paradigm shift where nations don't want to be known as people who violate this treaty. The US, Russia, and China have all passed domestic legislation banning the export of landmines, even though they don't wish to sign this treaty. So these treaties begin to create a moral momentum that carries weight even if they don't have teeth, even if they don't have enforcement mechanisms. And I believe they're one of the most hopeful things moving the world in a more positive direction, although it requires patience. Just like civil rights requires patience. Only this week, the man who murdered those civil rights workers in the South was indicted. Augusto Pinochet is just being tried now for what he did 30 years ago. But this system is creating hope, and one of those hopes comes in a permanent place where crimes against humanity and where war crimes and genocide can be adjudicated, the International Criminal Court, another treaty we refuse to sign. And so, in the year that Pinochet was indicted by this Spanish judge, the New York Times coined a new word, a new verb. It said that dictators and thugs around the world feared to travel lest they be Pinocheted. And justice is beginning to trickle around the world and the system, and it is a slow process, but it is one that gives me great hope, and it gives great hope to those activists who are struggling around the world that there is a system, there's of human rights that is slowly changing the world in a more sane direction. I could, of course, talk a lot about any of these things, and I'm going to try to wrap up very quickly. I have a wonderful piece of news to share that's just kind of beginning, but as you know, the service committee was started by some people who volunteered to go to Europe. First, it was Waitzel and Martha Sharp. Waitzel, a Unitarian minister, and Martha, his wife, who volunteered to go to Czechoslovakia to look into the situation of our Unitarian colleagues there who were being threatened with the impending invasion by the Nazis. And they were already being placed, dealing with many refugees who had fled Austria when the Nazis had already invaded there, and they were coming to Czechoslovakia. And later it was the Dexters who went to Europe on behalf of the Unitarian Service Committee and set up an underground railway, working with Very and Fry, getting people out of Vichy France, helping them to get all the paperwork necessary to get visas, because we were very bureaucratic about it at the time, to flee over the border on foot to Spain, to make their way to Portugal, and then be able to get to another country. Some came to the United States, some went to Africa, some went to South America. I don't know, how many of you saw Schindler's List? Good, lots of people. Well, at the end of that movie, you might have noticed that ceremony where they were putting stones, placing stones on a marker there. And that ceremony was held at a place called Yad Vashem, the memorial, the Holocaust Memorial of Israel, that is called, and the people who were so honored as he was for risking his life, Paul Schindler, for rescuing Jews, are honored as amongst the righteous of the nations. The award is only available to Gentiles, to non-Jews, who risk their life to save people in the Holocaust at personal risk. And we have just learned recently that Martha and Waitzel Sharp will be so honored probably in the next year or two, that their application process is underway, and it looks like it meets all the criteria. And so our founders will be honored. She will be the second American and the first American woman to be so honored. Waitzel, her husband, will be probably the third. And it looks like 3 or 4 of our other founders, Charles Joy, the Fieldings, and the Dexters, will also qualify. The sand is running out of the clock because you have to have someone who is living, who was rescued by them, and can provide credible testimony on the circumstances about their rescue. And of course, there are not many people still alive who can do that, but we have the testimonies, we think, located to probably qualify all of those. So before our 70th anniversary, which will happen in a few years, we will have a documentary about Martha Sharp and that early work. I think within the next 12 months, she will be honored in Israel with the Yad Vashem Award, and within a couple of years, we will make sure that our other founders are so honored as well. And I close on that because I think that not many of us have the chance to volunteer for something that is as dramatic as that, but we must believe that what we do volunteer for can have that impact in a cascading way, whether we're helping to advance the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or helping our neighbors understand the impact they can have in one of these efforts we're having to influence legislation, or whether we're inspiring someone to write a check or take a guess at your table box home and put money in it, because that allows us to do the work that we do. So I want to close and just thank all of you as volunteers and as local reps and as regional reps and as unit board members and others. And we do have, I didn't save as much time as I had wanted, but we do have 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and I'll be happy to answer anything about this or other things about the service committee. I see one right here.
Putting a note of pessimism into your picture, as a political scientist, I'm very aware of what goes on in the national administration. We have a Attorney General designate who once advised George W. Bush, when he was governor of Texas, that he did not have to alert the Mexican government about the execution of a Mexican national, because this was a national treaty and Texas hadn't signed it. So we have in the area of justice a lackey who will make any excuse to serve his master. And then, of course, recently we had a situation, of course, where Condi Rice in her confirmation hearings indicated that terrorists are not human beings, so they don't, Geneva does not apply. How do we deal with this stuff?
Well, I think it's a moment where a lot of people are asking similar questions about how this can happen in the United States and why the American people are so complacent about all of this. And let me just point out that this election that brought George Bush back to office was won in the end by 5 1/1000ths of 1% of the electorate. Had 50,000 votes in Ohio been different, George Bush would not have won. Despite a 3 million vote plurality of popular vote, he would have lost. And I think that there are many reasons for this, but I would like to say that I think that in the end, where many people perceive we're at war, it's a time when fear has been used very effectively by the administration. We have never unseated a wartime president. And frankly, John Kerry, whom I've known for years, could not distinguish himself in the war on terror or in the war on Iraq from George Bush. He said, we're going to do it smarter and better, but he did not distinguish himself. And I think that's what Americans were waiting for. And not hearing that, a majority of them thought that this tough talk and certainty talk by George Bush somehow made them safer or feel safer. And I think that's the margin of the election by which it was won. It's not the end of the world. It's going to be a difficult 4 years. I think we'll have a chance in 2 years to express our opinions again through many important Senate races and other House races, and hopefully the truth about the way that this administration has conducted its business will come to the forefront, and more Americans will wake up to this. It is a challenging time, but I think that we, as Unitarians, have risen to these times. I heard some people talking about going to Canada after the election, and I gave a sermon in Santa Fe after that election, and the sermon was called "What Would Julia Do?" And it was about Julia Ward Howe, who was an electoral activist in New England, who never voted in her lifetime, who was beaten up and was arrested and would stand in the snow and rain and be ridiculed. And when she lost, she didn't give up and move to Canada. She kept fighting. And that's what we need to do. And we need to be inspired by people like her and look at their lives and understand them and be inspired by that kind of stamina. Or Theodore Parker, the Unitarian minister from Boston, who led the Boston opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act when others were using the scriptures to justify arresting slaves. He harbored them in his home and was arrested indicted by a federal grand jury. I think we need to take inspiration from those who came before us and understand it's a difficult moment, but not a hopeless one by any means. Yes?
You mentioned the free trade coffee operation and delegations to Central America to coffee plantations. Could you elaborate a little bit more about that?
The question was about our economic justice track and delegations, and let me say that in general, I led a number of congressional delegations to Central America in the 1980s, and some of those members of Congress who are still serving have said how those experiences changed their life. So it is my intent to greatly expand that kind of experiential education, not for members of Congress, but for activists like yourselves and ordinary UUs. And if in 3 years you can't look in the magazine The World and see a column on the right saying, join USC here in January and do this in February, then you should call for my job to be ended, because that's the kind of opportunities I want to make available. We have two people in the room, Peter and Lenore, Peter Landecker and Laura Snowdy, who joined us on the first of those delegations that we had resurrected since my coming here. I don't think we had done one in 5 years before I rejoined the Service Committee last year. But we intend to greatly increase those so that in all of our program areas, people can actually have what I call experiential education, and that is contact with people, touching our work, as I sometimes call it, because I think it transforms lives. And I think that we need to do a lot more of that, because I think the kind of activism that is inspired by that is permanent. I don't know, Peter, if you'd like to, or Lenore, say a word or two. They went on one of these delegations to us to monitor the elections in Guatemala. you on the spot, Peter, but we have a witness here.
All right. Well, it was a special opportunity for me to experience UUSC in action, and on two fronts. One was especially in light of the lack of the democratic process in the past in Guatemala, to actually experience the democratic process firsthand. Lenore and I had badges, and we could ask questions, and we saw the process, and it really seemed honest to us. And the people there seemed very grateful that we took the trouble to monitor their election and have it be an honest one. And as far as I could see, it was an honest one. I was very impressed by that experience. And the other experience we had on the same trip was to meet various UUSC partners, people who had been previously supported either financially or mentally, or as kindred organizations, to support justice and equality in Guatemala. So just seeing that in action, seeing actual people, was a very special and unusual experience for Lenore and me. To actually talk to people, to find out firsthand what was going on, and to see the work of the UUSC, those were, in my opinion, very, very special experiences which I'll cherish forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And his partner, Lenore Snowdy, is with him as well, but we'll spare her having to make a testimonial, unless you'd like to, and you're most welcome to. So I have another question here from this. So we're going to have more of those. You're going to meet some of the people involved in these cooperatives. You're going to kind of meet people involved in fair trade issues. I think before the end of the year, we're going to have a delegation to Costa Rica. A Costa Rican lawyer came to me the other day and said that their National Assembly is evenly split between supporting the Free Trade Americas Agreement and opposing it. He thinks that some energy from a U.S. NGO like ours could help them to maybe stand up the United States and not pass that free trade agreement, and that might be kind of a beginning of a number of countries that might do so. So I think we'll have a delegation to Costa Rica before too long. Our economic justice program is not quite as far underway as our civil liberties, but it'll be unfolding rapidly. Dan, you had a question?
Yes, I would like to hear you, if you would, tell us briefly how you came about to the position you have now, from the rigid indoctrination you got from the Air Force Academy, and what the military tried to do to your mind. Where was it that you got this conscience?
Well, I think, we have such little time here. What I'm going to mention to you is that the American Fringe Service Committee made a documentary that won an Academy Award in 1985 called Witness to War. And that documentary kind of traces the evolution of my journey of conscience from being an Air Force pilot and a distinguished graduate of the Air Force Academy. And we have loaner copies of that we're happy to make available to congregations. I should mention it was a stepwise process. Some of it started right here in Los Angeles, when after the Air Force Academy I went to UCLA to 8 months of graduate school. And about the last Wednesday of the month, we would have to wear our uniform to class, all the ROTC people and people on active duty. And the Quakers and other activists would set up this cordon of this silent vigil that we had to walk through. And I used to walk through them thinking, these folks are naive. I have a better understanding of this threat that is facing us in Asia. I'll go to Asia and defend their right to free speech. But I was struck by their, whether it was raining or cold, that they were always out there. They didn't kind of make fun of me like other people did. And later in Vietnam, when I kind of ran into Quakers working over there in a prosthetics clinic, and they'd be run over by one side and run over by the other side, I thought back to those people back at UCLA. And so it was a stepwise process of many awakenings along the way. And I welcome you to borrow that film. I think the AFSC did a good job on it, and I've written a book that tells a little bit more about it that we have copies of at the service committee that are out of print, but we sell inexpensively. But I would like to say it's a journey of conscience that I think all people can make, and that we shouldn't give up on people because of where they are politically. I think we're all a result of our experiences in life. And my experiences were on military bases with a military family. I credit my father with giving me a sense of service. My sense of how to serve has changed, and I was educated at a place that I look back upon that was probably brainwashing me at the Air Force Academy. But I was capable of making that transition slowly, and I think we should think that most people are. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I do encourage you. We'll be happy to lend you that film. Ken?
Yes, on the issue of water, what are some of the next steps or priorities that we in a local community can look at? I hear privatization as a key word, and I'm not sure. There are some things in California that there's talk about privatization, but I'm not sure whether it's state or federal levels that you're thinking of the next step on the water issues.
Well, we'll have to have a lot of different kinds of steps. And so, one of the largest water battles of privatization that took place that was lost recently, I say lost because Stockton decided to privatize, is outlined in a film called Thirst that talks about this incredible battle. But a lot of the privatization that's going on is taking place behind closed doors. So Lawrence, Massachusetts recently found out that their city council had 19 closed-door meetings and all but signed this 30-year document to privatize their water system before they found out about it. So we will be giving you a series of organizing packets about what to look for and what to understand about your own water supply. It may be that yours isn't threatened. There may be other issues related to water that you can get involved in your own community. Not the least of which, I'm not going to go into great detail now, but the way that we use and waste water on the planet. And so, the amount of water that it takes to grow a pound of soy, is about 1,500 gallons compared to a pound of beef, which is about 150,000 gallons. It's just a remarkable difference in the way that we use water. And right now, one thing we're doing is getting developing countries to export their beef to us. So they use all their water to grow beef, and then they export it to us. So we're draining them of their water to feed us in ways that are totally wasteful if we understand something about the water balance. So we'll be providing materials like that. You'll have to give us a little bit of time to begin to develop this. We're hiring someone in the next few weeks to lead that. We have a lot of interesting candidates. But we'll be providing you with some guidelines about how to engage people in these conversations and what kinds of things you can do locally. Yes?
There's a book out called Addicted to War. It's like in a comic book format. And I think a lot of these things that you talked about at the beginning, how they go in and say they're going to make everything better, and have a booklet like that, because a lot of people now are not used to reading.
You're absolutely right. And the guy that does that, Addicted to War, I think I met him in the parking lot of the Encuentro in Pasadena last year, and he's just like a missionary out there, passing this book out and doing a great job of it. We need many, many different ways of engaging people, and I should mention that films are part of it, and I think humorous ways to approach things, and we'll be trying to make those available. And with regard to water, someplace you could start, there's an Indian physicist named Vandana Shiva that has written one of the best books on water. It's called Water Wars. It's terrific. It's very accessible in terms of how it's written. She is going to be someone that we're working with. There's a Canadian named Maud Barlow who's written a book called Blue Gold, and I think it is also a very accessible and terrific book on that. So those are resources you could start with in terms of educating yourselves about this, because that's always where we have to start as activists. Yes, and
Do you know the name? Do you know the name? Okay, do you know the name of any of the American companies that are buying up water rights in Canada? Maybe we could write letters to them or somehow take some social action against them.
The question is, do I know the name of any American companies buying up the water rights? Like everything else in the world, the companies that have been involved with water are beginning to kind of aggregate, and there's about 6 large companies, and none of them are American. So there's a French company, there's a German company, Thames Water is the British company, there's Suez, one used to be called, it's called Variola now, the French company. So there are no American companies of the large players doing this, but for instance, one of the largest American companies that runs the water systems of many communities around the country is called American Waterworks. American Waterworks was bought up by one of these by the German company, I believe. So part of what we'll be doing is providing some analysis of that, but there are no major American players now that Enron has gone out of business in this. Dave, you've been very patient with your question.
You mentioned a pastor in Portland who said that working with the economic justice issues was the most difficult thing they'd done. Can you expand on that a little bit?
It's Marilyn Sewell, and she is one of the founders of Unitarian Universalist for a Just Economic Community, an organization that has been around working with Unitarians for years, trying to get them involved in issues of globalization. And I think, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think what she was saying is that because this issue causes us to have to look at ourselves and the way that we live and our own privilege in ways that can be awkward for people, or perhaps even threatening, that it is more difficult to get people to engage in it than it is other issues where we're talking about what those bad people are doing to those people. I think that's a simplification of it, but Marilyn's a very thoughtful person and a very good organizer. Her church is full of social justice activities. I mean, I think they're one of the role models for us. But when she said how challenging it's been, it made me think, we're in for some challenges, but that's what we're about. We should be doing that. We should find ways to be creative. Lenore?
Coming back to the issue of torture and crimes against humanity, you mentioned Pinochet and the man in the South, Alabama, I think, or Mississippi. Anyway, being now brought to justice. Well, we know, of course, that Rios Montt was defeated because of the elections in Guatemala, and he is not under arrest now. He's not he's not president, but he still has influence. Are there any chances that he might be actually brought to justice? What's your assessment of that?
Leonore is referring to the general whose name is Rios Montt, who took power in a coup in 1982 or 83. He was in power 2 years before he was forced out by other military men. And the Truth Commission in Guatemala estimates that over the course of that civil war of almost a quarter century, 200,000 Mayans were murdered or killed, and that half of them were murdered on his watch in those 2 years. He had a scorched earth policy, abetted, I might add, by evangelicals in this country, because he was an evangelical preacher himself. He was running for the presidency and was defeated during the election that we monitored. Some of the NGOs that we work with down there, and NGOs mean non-governmental organizations. It's what people around the world call not-for-profits. Some of the NGOs that we work with down there have been preparing indictments for crimes against humanity. I believe that Judge Garzón in Spain is preparing an indictment as well, so that if Judge Garzón indicts Rios Montt, then it will mean that if he leaves the country, if he travels outside the country, that Interpol will arrest him, because Interpol is the one who would be responsible, the International Police Organization, responsible for that. I think that Rios Montt may be indicted in the coming year. Our charges will be prepared against him, and whether justice can go forward in Guatemala or not remains to be seen. The truth is probably not. But there have been attempts to indict Pinochet for 30 years in Chile that have just finally succeeded. So if the first efforts are not successful in Guatemala, I think maybe second or third tier efforts could be. I might mention that someone that we met with, who sat in that room in Robinel, Carlos Chin, who is one of the survivors of the Rio Negro massacre and is an important eyewitness who will be important in court, was just arrested on Friday. You'll be getting action alert about that. We need to protect him. I think that he's probably considered dangerous to the state because he was a witness to what went on there. So justice unfolds slowly and sometimes unpredictably, but with people continuing to try to push for it, I think that Guatemala will eventually have a civil society where justice can be found. And before getting to that point, it's often a matter of shining a spotlight on that dark corner of American history, or I say American history because we fomented the coup in Guatemala in 1954. We paid for it. That led to so many decades of military repression there. But it often begins by shining a light in a dark corner of human behavior. That's the starting of that process, and eventually, hopefully, justice will prevail. I think we have to believe that, or it's hard for us to do the work that we do. I think I'm getting a signal that it's probably time to wrap up this Q&A. Chris?
Well, I was just going to say, why don't you take another question or two, and then we'll take a short break for anybody who wants to use the ladies' and gentlemen's room or get a cup of coffee, and then we will reassemble to discuss how we're going to put these programs into action in our local congregation. We got a lot of good materials, a lot of good ideas. We want to hear from you. But why don't you take another question or two, and then we'll wrap up this portion. You'll be able to stay around during the break period to talk
Yes.
to anybody. Okay.
Great. George?
I've heard that you continue to, as a physician, to practice medicine. I'm wondering how you balance the time and energy it takes to do that, to do the work you're doing with the committee and the Human Rights Committee you helped form. Could you take a minute?
Well, the rumors are unfounded. For some years I've considered myself a public health physician. And public health physicians are usually engaged in preventive medicine more than kind of curative medicine. And I look at the human rights system as probably the best piece of preventive medicine that is unfolding slowly and over decades to bring about better health in the world. So I've devoted myself to that for some years, and I'm afraid that's the only kind of medicine I find time to practice. But I feel like everything I do is informed by my kind of experiences as a physician and the lenses I have and the way I think about human well-being. And I think that physicians often perform incredibly valuable services, but they have a pretty narrow perspective. They treat diseases, and sometimes we need to look at the conditions that create those diseases, and I feel that's what focusing on public health and human rights does. So thanks for the question. Yes?
You spoke extensively about justice activity. What voluntary and other legal resources do we have in UU to push forward in this area? I mean, lawyers, law firms, et cetera.
Let me just mention that we have a lawyer on our staff, Jennifer Harbury, who is probably the leading spokesperson about these issues in the country, and one who's been working on it nonstop for 10 years and is widely recognized. She, called up Michael Posner from Human Rights First, who is a colleague of hers, and she's well connected to the legal community around the country dealing with these issues. We are very fortunate at the Service Committee, this gives me a moment to recognize them, that we have a law firm that does all of our law work pro bono. We have not paid for any legal work for, I think, more than a decade, and it's wonderful, and that they want to provide that service to us. I think in this effort to deal with the lawlessness of this administration, there are many in the legal community around the country that are quite concerned about this, and I think some in this room. Ruth, you're a lawyer, aren't you? And there are.
I'm a Social Security lawyer.
Well, that's all right. There's
That's a big issue.
right. That's going to be a big battle too. So I think there are many, and that we do have a lot of allies. And it is one does not accomplish any of these things alone as activists or as organizations these days. That we work in concert with others, in coalitions, in an effort to change these things, and UUSC, will work side by side with many organizations. Yes, Ted? Or
I have an organizational question, and that is, I have kind of a sense of what's going on in Southern California, but nationally, how is the generational problem of the UUSC? So how are you involving youth What kind of outreach are you doing? How much is that an issue on your agenda?
Well, I think it's a great question. You know, as I was thinking about my comments this morning, I wanted to say to you, and I thought, oh, maybe I don't have time to do this, that I'm 59 years old now. And so I figure I have about 11 years left in this job if I do a good job and kept there. And in that period of time, I look at my mandate as to pass the torch. And I think all of us in this room should be thinking about that too, as we look around the room and see the average age of most of us. You know, our challenge is to engage the next generation or the next generations of activists and how to do that. So we've begun that process at USC. And I say begun because it's going to be a process that I think that takes a decade. I went to the Loretta meeting this year. That's the Association of Religious Leaders and ministers that do religious education. You know, they are providing kind of a corridor or moral development for youth within this religious tradition. And an executive director or president of the USC had never been to their meeting, had never bothered to engage them. And after I went to that meeting, I was telling a couple of ministers about it, and they kind of scoffed as if that wasn't a good use of my time. And I think it's a great use of my time because I think that they're going to be allies with us. So last year, at my urging, we created a work camp called a Civil Rights Journey that went from Atlanta to Selma to Montgomery to Birmingham, and then came back for 3 days of voter registration. And of the 21 young adults on that, I've personally met about 4 of them, but parents of about 4 of the other ones have come up and told me their children's lives were transformed and forever changed by that experience, that they've been activists in their high school, that a day doesn't go by where they don't speak about that experience. I think we need to provide many of those kind of experiences. One of the problems with our work camps is they've jumped around to different places, and you've never known in advance when they're going to be. You can count on this every 10 years for the next 10 years. There's going to be a civil rights journey leaving about the second week in July, and we invite you, if you have 6-year-olds now, they're going to be 16 and 10 years, plan on giving them that gift. We invite you to go with them. We're making it intergenerational now, so that, in fact, there's an advertisement for it that Chris is holding up that will be in your packet. It's going to be in the UU World, but this year we're expanding that from 20 to about 50. I should say that the work in work camps is changing from the emphasis being on external work to internal work. So there was a lot of reflections on this. They were asked to journal. It was led by a young minister. In the last issue of the Service Committee News, if you haven't read it, there's a page from a diary of a young woman who went on that. I encourage you to read it. I was having my wife read it to me as we drove up to her parents' place at Thanksgiving, and she was crying so much she couldn't finish reading it to me. It's very touching. It's the kind of experiences we should be giving to young people so that we can pass the torch. So, Tiago, I'll just say that I'm aware of this problem, and we're trying to expand the opportunities that we have for youth. We're talking about putting a youth on our board of directors, but I think that in a way can be window dressing unless there's a lot of other stuff that goes with that to engage youth. We have staff that are trying to understand the different structures within the UUA where youth gather and express themselves, and we need to be a part of that, and I hope that we will be, or we won't be around in another 20 years if we don't engage our youth audience. I think it's probably time to take a break. I want to say it's great to see so many old friends and so many new friends, and I appreciate, again, all the work that so many people put into making this event possible today. So thank you all, even if I didn't mention you by name. Thanks. But thank you as well. You know, someone pointed out to me, and it's a terrible oversight on my part, that I didn't say anything about tsunami relief. And please accept my apologies. I think there were so many things I wanted to mention. So we have now raised, I think, over $1 million in tsunami relief from our website and from generous contributions of individuals and churches who were sending in contributions from special collections. I want to compare that to 911, in which we raised about $1 million, but $500,000 of that came from one corporate donor. So we have far exceeded that, and I say about $1 million because I left the service committee on Thursday, and we were at $925,000. We are trying to update our website every 2 or 3 days with some accounts of survivors, of some of the partners that we're working with. I think there's a tally of how much money we're raising, and we're trying to update that frequently as well. So check our website if you're a computer user. I should mention that Bob Snow, who is the head of our Institutional Advancement Committee in the back, I knew him 20 years ago when he worked at Oxfam, and part of his responsibility was evaluations of disaster response. I'm the founder of the International Medical Relief Fund, and I've done similar work for about 15 years off and on. So we have some experience in this, and we decided it didn't make any sense at all for us to try to compete with the agencies that devote themselves to this day in and day out, like Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the World Food Program, UNICEF. They are providing the immediate medical care and shelter needs and food of the thousands of survivors that are affected by this. And what we decided to focus on was restoring the livelihoods of the fishing villages, which were amongst the poorest and most devastated of the victims because they were on the edge of the coast. They own no land. They all squat. They are amongst the poorest and most marginalized in almost every one of those countries affected. So we are focusing on them. We are working with some partners that we have known or holding India has known for some years. I hope that you noticed a hand-in-glove collaboration with the UUA, that we've been working very closely with them over the last year. I'm proud to say that we're opening our DC office next week, and we're opening it in their offices. We're going to be sharing office space with them. On the disaster response, we were in communication within 24 hours. Our websites have been making references to each other. I could not have been pleased with how helpful and collaborative the relationship has been. We started to put something up on our website about resources for services, and they said, oh, we've already got that, and so we referred people over there, and they're collaborating at many, many different levels, which has enabled us to raise as much money as we have. Kathy Sridhar of the Holding Trust is in Tamil Nadu, one of the affected areas of India at the moment. We immediately funded a number of her longtime partners who were in the area. We funded some of ours in India. And we've been working with Via Campesina, an international kind of network of organizations that are amongst the poorest of both peasant farmers and fisher people. And so their partners in Indonesia and Sri Lanka have been people that we're in contact with. We're repairing fishing boats. We're repairing fishing nets. We're getting them new nets. We're going to be helping them find used boats in the area because one side of Sri Lanka was not affected by this. And there are plenty of fishing boats on that side. This disaster has been different than many others because there is this band of horrible destruction, but inside that everything is functioning. So we're in email contact 4 times a day with some of our partners. We got money out the door within probably 4 days of when we received it because the banks were open on the other side of that band of destruction. So this is going to be, we'll probably be engaged in this for at least a year in terms of this rehabilitation of livelihoods. We think it's very important that these fisher people begin to earn money again and begin to fish to provide food for their communities. And it fits with our kind of focus on economic justice. So you'll be hearing more about this in time. I think there's a question in the back.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that I tried to donate to the USC online for the tsunami relief, and there was something with the page that I wasn't able to do it, and I was able to do it with Oxfam. So I don't know if it was my particular computer, but I wanted you to
you know, we are aware there have been difficulties, and they happen at many levels. And so, for instance, in the immediate days afterwards, one of the problems was that the agencies the background to our website is agencies that tabulate those credit card numbers and contact the company and get the approvals. Were jammed with 6 people coming in at the same time, and they could only service 5 of them, so one would be rejected. There are many other reasons that people get rejected, including what are called cookies and kind of technical issues about your own computer and ours. And so we encourage you to try again. And if you're unable to donate by mail or to donate to someone else if you can't and you want to make an immediate one. We do know that about it seems like 1 in 100 people aren't able to for some reason that's technical. But we also have people working almost around the clock and trying to resolve those problems. But we know there are many other terrific organizations out there. We would like to have your contribution, but it's, you know, we also look at the other organizations as our colleagues in doing good work. So I think that's probably enough. I'd be happy to answer more questions about this. Again, thank you all very much.